He sat across from the most powerful man in the communist world, behind closed doors, no press, no public record. And somewhere in that room, Xi Jinping issued a warning to Donald Trump about Taiwan that his own foreign ministry described as a threat of clashes and even conflicts. Not in a speech, not in a press release, face to face, and sitting right there in that meeting, unscheduled, unannounced, were Elon Musk, Tim Cook, and the CEO of NVIDIA. Nobody expected that. This is what actually happened inside Beijing. Beijing, May 2026. 2 days. Two of the most consequential leaders alive. One room that could shift the direction of global trade, energy markets, and the fragile peace over one of the most disputed pieces of land on Earth. President Donald Trump landed in China for a 2-day summit with President Xi Jinping, his most significant diplomatic meeting of his second term so far. The agenda was already loaded before anyone sat down. Trade, Taiwan, Iran, and a blockade of one of the world's most critical waterways. Day 1 ran 2 hours and 15 minutes. Day 2 adds a working lunch before Trump boards Air Force One back to the United States. On the surface, the imagery was warm. A grand welcome ceremony at the Great Hall of the People. Public smiles, Trump calling Xi a tremendous leader, Xi calling for stability. But underneath that, according to China's own foreign ministry, Xi delivered language that has not been used in years. A direct warning: Taiwan. And what happens if Washington gets it wrong? If you want fact-based coverage that cuts through the noise on a story this significant, subscribe right now, because the implications of what was agreed and what wasn't are still unfolding. Let's go inside the room. Trump arrived in Beijing for what his administration framed as an opportunity to stabilize a relationship that had been turbulent from the very first months of his second term. Tariffs, tech restrictions, accusations flying in both directions across the Pacific. The summit was 2 days. The first day opened with what sources described as a grand welcome ceremony at the Great Hall of the People, one of China's most symbolically significant venues. Cameras caught the handshakes, the flags, the formal posture of two men who each believe they represent the dominant power of the 21st century. Then the doors closed. What came out of that first session, confirmed by China's foreign ministry and by Secretary of State Marco Rubio, was more complicated than the smiles suggested. Xi warned Trump about Taiwan, not vaguely, not diplomatically softened. China's foreign ministry reported that Xi told Trump directly, mishandling Beijing's claims over the self-governing island could cause clashes and even conflicts. That language, clashes and even conflicts, coming from the leader of a nuclear-armed nation to the President of the United States in a private bilateral meeting, is not routine diplomatic friction. That is a calibrated signal. Rubio confirmed the Taiwan discussion happened. He also confirmed they discussed the Iran war, an ongoing conflict that has now blockaded the Strait of Hormuz, one of the world's most critical oil passages. Rubio said the U.S. was not asking China for help with Iran, but the fact that it came up in a bilateral summit focused on trade tells you how interconnected these crises have become. Then came the moment nobody had planned for. Trump, in his own words to Fox News, said that at the start of the formal meeting with Xi, he brought in a group of executives who had traveled with him. Not on the official schedule, not pre-announced. Elon Musk, Tim Cook, Jensen Huang, the CEO of NVIDIA. Trump told Sean Hannity, I suggested that before we start the meeting, I'd like to introduce them to you, and they were surprised because it wasn't scheduled. These are the three men who collectively run the most powerful private technology empires in America. Companies with enormous stakes in what China decides to do next on trade, on technology restrictions, on rare earth materials. And Trump walked them into the room. Xi reportedly did not object. Day 2 was set to include tea, a photo, and a working lunch before Trump departed for the United States. But by the time night fell on day 1, the announcements had already started moving markets. China's foreign ministry put Taiwan on the record as a potential conflict trigger. But Trump's own trade representative, the man negotiating the fine print, refused to confirm whether the trade truce between the US and China would even survive the week. What exactly was agreed to, and what was left deliberately unanswered? Start with energy, because that's where it gets personal for almost everyone. Iran has blockaded the Strait of Hormuz. That single waterway carries roughly 20% of all the world's oil supply. Trump discussed reopening it with Xi. Why Xi? Because China gets approximately 40% of its oil from that region. Trump said so himself in the Hannity interview. China has more immediate economic pain from that blockade than almost any other nation on Earth. Trump announced that Xi agreed to consider buying oil from the United States instead. American oil, shipped from Texas, Louisiana, and Alaska, on Chinese vessels. Trump's exact words: "We're going to start sending Chinese ships to Texas and to Louisiana and to Alaska." He added, "I think it'll happen." Now, agreed to consider is not a signed contract, but if that arrangement moves forward at any meaningful scale, it reshapes global energy flows. It reduces China's dependence on Middle Eastern oil. It increases American export revenue, and it creates a new economic interdependency between the two countries that neither side can easily tear apart. That interdependency is precisely the point. Economic ties are meant to make military confrontation more costly. That's the logic behind the entire summit. Then there's agriculture. U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer said publicly on Bloomberg TV that he expects double-digit billion-dollar purchases of American agricultural products to follow the summit. For American farmers, that's a significant lifeline in a period of ongoing trade uncertainty. But Greer also said something that largely got buried. He was asked whether the current trade truce, the ceasefire that has been holding back a full tariff escalation between the world's two largest economies, would be extended after Trump's visit. His response? "We'll see about that." 3 words. That's all. No confirmation, no reassurance. For investors, for businesses, for supply chains that have spent months navigating uncertainty, that non-answer is its own kind of signal. And then there's the chip question. NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang boarded Air Force One in Alaska at the last minute to join the trip. That move alone sent NVIDIA shares and other tech stocks rallying because markets read it as a possible sign that Chinese customers might gain access to American semiconductors again. Greer was asked directly, did chip export controls come up in the meetings? He laughed slightly, then said, "We did not talk about chip export controls." So Huang flew across the Pacific, sat in the room with Xi, and the topic of his company's core product, the thing that defines the entire AI arms race between the US and China, apparently wasn't officially on the agenda. Think about what that implies. Do you think this summit actually resolved anything? Or are these two sides simply buying time? Let me know in the comments. On rare earth elements, the materials that make your phone, your EV, your medical equipment, Greer gave China what he called a passing grade, acknowledging that Beijing sometimes delays export approvals. That passing grade, delivered publicly, suggests the US side is choosing accommodation over confrontation on that issue. For now, the contradiction at the heart of this summit is this. The public language was warm and cooperative. The private language, Taiwan, Iran, trade truce uncertainty, was anything but simple. Here's what deserves more attention than it's getting. Marco Rubio traveled to Beijing while under active Chinese sanctions. That is reportedly a first for a US Secretary of State, visiting a country that has formally sanctioned him. China allowed it anyway, and Beijing has not lifted those sanctions. So China welcomed into their capital the man they have officially declared persona non grata to negotiate the future of the relationship. That is either a significant gesture of pragmatism from Beijing, or it is a deliberate choice to keep Rubio at a disadvantage in his own foreign capital at the negotiating table. Neither of those explanations is entirely comfortable. Step back from the diplomacy for a moment and think about what this summit means to people who will never set foot in Beijing. In Texas and Louisiana, energy workers are watching whether Chinese tankers actually start arriving at American ports. If Trump's oil deal with Xi materializes, even partially, it means production increases, jobs, export revenue. But it also means American energy becomes strategically tied to a relationship that, within the very same summit, produced a direct warning about military conflict over Taiwan. That tension is not theoretical for the families of US military personnel stationed in the Pacific. There are tens of thousands of American service members in Japan, South Korea, Guam, and aboard naval vessels in waters adjacent to Taiwan. When Xi says clashes and even conflicts to a sitting American president, those words reach people whose sons and daughters wear uniforms. In China, the stakes for ordinary people look different but are no less acute. Young Chinese workers have been navigating economic pressure for years. A real estate slowdown, youth unemployment that reached record levels in recent years, and the psychological weight of a government that increasingly equates national identity with economic performance. A trade deal that brings in American agricultural goods doesn't immediately change those pressures, but continued tariff escalation would make them significantly worse. For American farmers, particularly in the Midwest, which has felt the strain of agricultural trade disruption since the first Trump term, the promise of double-digit billion purchases from China is significant. But Greer's "we'll see about that" on the trade truce means the framework those purchases depend on is still not confirmed. The Taiwan dimension affects people far beyond the island's 23 million residents. Taiwan produces roughly 90% of the world's most advanced semiconductors. If conflict ever disrupted that supply chain, even for weeks, the effects on global manufacturing, hospitals, transportation systems, and consumer goods would be immediate and severe. That's not speculation. That's supply chain geography. And then there's Iran. The Strait of Hormuz blockade has already pushed global oil prices into territory that affects heating costs, transportation costs, food prices, everything that moves. The fact that Trump and Xi agreed, at minimum, that the strait should not be militarized, Rubio's word, is a baseline of diplomatic alignment. But a verbal agreement between two leaders who have different definitions of militarization is not a solution to a physical blockade. There are families in Europe, in South Asia, in East Africa, whose energy costs are directly tied to how quickly that waterway reopens. They weren't in the room at the Great Hall of the People, but the decisions made there land in their lives. Rubio confirmed that Trump also raised the case of Jimmy Lai, a pro-democracy publisher in Hong Kong sentenced to 20 years in prison on national security charges. That case has become a symbol for press freedom advocates worldwide. Raising it in Beijing to Xi directly is significant. But what, if anything, was said in response? That part has not been publicly disclosed. The gap between what we know was discussed and what we know was resolved is still enormous. The trade truce has a clock on it, and nobody in a position of authority will confirm it gets extended. If it expires, the tariff escalation that rattled markets earlier in Trump's term could resume, with both sides now more dug in than before. On Taiwan, Xi's warning doesn't go away when Trump boards Air Force One. Beijing's position on the island has not shifted, and Taiwan's own government, which has had no seat at these talks, is watching every word from a distance. The Strait of Hormuz remains physically blocked. A verbal agreement that it shouldn't be militarized doesn't reopen it. And Jensen Huang flew to Beijing, sat in the room, and came home, with chip export controls apparently never officially discussed. Markets rallied on the optics, but the underlying restrictions are unchanged. Every one of these threads is still live. What does this summit actually mean? It means the United States and China chose, at this particular moment, not to let the relationship collapse further. That is not a small thing. These are the two largest economies on Earth. They are the two countries whose decisions on trade, technology, and military posture will define the structure of global power for the next generation. What they did not do, and this matters, is resolve anything fundamental. Taiwan remains disputed. The Strait of Hormuz remains blocked. Chip restrictions remain in place. Chinese sanctions on Rubio remain in place. The trade truce remains unconfirmed for extension. What they produced is a framework of continued engagement, oil discussions, agricultural purchase expectations, a shared statement that a critical waterway shouldn't be weaponized, and the extraordinary visual of Elon Musk and Tim Cook sitting in a bilateral meeting between two nuclear-armed governments. Historically, these kinds of summits matter because of what they prevent as much as what they produce. The US-China relationship has been under structural pressure for nearly a decade. Competing claims in the South China Sea, technology decoupling efforts, supply chain realignment, Taiwan arms sales. A summit that ends without a breakdown is, by that standard, a success. But Xi's Taiwan warning tells you something important. Beijing is not softening its core positions. The friendliness was real on a personal level. Trump himself called Xi warm, but all business. That assessment is probably more accurate than the ceremony suggested. Governments across Asia are now digesting what was said and what wasn't. Japan, South Korea, Australia, the Philippines. All of them have security relationships with the United States that intersect with China's strategic ambitions. All of them have been watching for any signal that Washington might be adjusting its commitment to the region in exchange for economic benefit. Intelligence agencies on multiple continents are running through the transcripts, every word, every pause, every moment where the public readout and the private meeting diverge. And they do diverge. China's foreign ministry described the Taiwan warning publicly. The US side's readout of the same meeting was notably different in emphasis. Two countries, one meeting, two narratives. That gap is where the real analysis lives, and that gap is still open. What happens in the days after Trump lands back in the United States will tell us whether this summit was a turning point or a pause, whether the trade truce holds, whether the oil deal moves from words to actual ships, whether Beijing's Taiwan warning produces any policy response from Washington. Nobody who was in that room is showing all their cards. The next 72 hours after a summit like this are when the real story emerges. In markets, in policy moves, in official statements that quietly shift away from what was said publicly. What do you think actually came out of Beijing? Was this a genuine reset, or two sides agreeing to agree with very different plans behind the scenes? Drop your read in the comments and subscribe, because this story doesn't end when Air Force One lands. The trade truce deadline, the Taiwan question, the Iran blockade, every one of those threads is still moving, and we'll be here when the next development breaks.